July 6, 2026, 11:58 p.m. 2 Ukrainian strike packages are airborne simultaneously over occupied territory. 14 drones on one vector, 9 on another, 60 kilometers apart, both targeting the same air defense umbrella. The crew of a single Pantsir S-1 battery has no idea they're about to face the most sophisticated drone coordination Ukraine has ever executed. They have enough missiles to stop one wave, not both. In 4 minutes, that mathematical reality becomes catastrophic for the Russian military. Welcome to War Vector. I'm your host, and tonight we're breaking down the dual strike operation of July 6th, a night when Ukrainian planners didn't just hit 2 targets. They engineered a collapse. A precision collapse of radar coverage, infrastructure, and command communications that left 3 Russian army groups tactically blind during a cold June night in occupied Luhansk. This is the story of how Ukraine fought like a peer military, and why Russia's own internal assessments describe what happened as something they didn't anticipate from a non-state actor. That phrase, non-state actor. Russia's own commanders used it, and it tells you everything about how badly they underestimated what was coming. Because what Ukraine executed that night wasn't improvised. It wasn't desperate. It was the result of months of surveillance, planning, and an intelligence breakthrough that identified a single critical vulnerability in Russia's deep rear air defense architecture. A 60-kilometer arc, 1 battery, 2 targets inside it. The planners in Kyiv found the gap and drove 2 strike packages straight through it. By the time the sun rose on July 7th, a gas compression station was offline, a satellite relay hub was dark, and Russian commanders were sending messages on civilian frequencies trying to reach units they couldn't contact through any military channel. The encrypted datalinks were gone, the pipeline pressure had collapsed, and the Pantsir crew had fired every missile they had in 90 seconds, and hit nothing that mattered. This is what modern warfare looks like when intelligence, timing, and nerve converge. Real tactics, real consequences. War Vector. To understand why this operation matters, you have to go back several months, to the intelligence picture that Ukrainian GUR analysts were assembling through late winter and spring of 2026. Satellite imagery from commercial providers had been tracking Russian logistics patterns in Luhansk Oblast since October 2025, when a significant reshuffling of rear area units began following Ukrainian pressure on the eastern front line. What analysts noticed wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A Pantsir S-1 battery that had been stationed near Starobilsk was repositioned twice between November and January, eventually settling into a deployment site roughly 30 kilometers east of the Novopskov gas compression station. The battery's radar coverage arc was mapped using emission signatures captured by Ukrainian electronic intelligence assets. Patient, methodical work spanning several weeks. The compression station itself had been on Ukrainian targeting lists since mid-2025. It sat at a critical junction in the Russian gas distribution network serving occupied Luhansk, feeding pipeline segments that supplied not just civilian infrastructure, but the logistical tail of Russian forces in the region. Vehicle heating systems for Russian armor units, fuel conditioning equipment at forward operating bases, generator systems at command posts. All of them dependent on stable gas pressure from this facility. Destroy the compression capacity, and you don't just cut civilian heating. You create cascading mechanical problems for military equipment in cold weather. The satellite relay station in Voronezh Oblast was a different kind of target, deeper inside Russian territory, further from the front, and far more valuable from a command disruption perspective. GUR analysts had been tracking its function through a combination of signals, intelligence, and open-source corroboration since late 2025, when Ukrainian communications intercept teams noticed that encrypted traffic volumes spiked through this facility whenever Russian operational commands issued synchronized orders to multiple army groups. The station was a relay node, not the source of the communications, but a critical switch in the network. Take it offline, and you don't just silence one headquarters. You fragment the entire architecture. Which weapon system did the most strategic damage that night? The Liutyi drones hitting infrastructure, or the Beaver drones cutting communications? Comment below with your analysis. A. Liutyi strike on the gas plant. B. Beaver strike on the satellite hub. C. The combination was inseparable. This is the debate that military analysts are still having. The connection between the 2 targets wasn't obvious until a GUR analyst, identity protected, referred to in Ukrainian military reporting only by the operational call sign architect, ran an overlay analysis comparing the mapped radar coverage of the repositioned Pantsir battery against the geographic coordinates of both the compression station and the Voronezh relay hub. Both targets fell within the same 60-kilometer radar arc, not adjacent, not overlapping, the same arc. A single battery was the primary air defense asset covering both facilities. I've spent time going through the operational assessments that emerged from this strike, and one detail kept pulling my attention back. The distance between the 2 targets, roughly 60 kilometers, is almost exactly the engagement radius limitation of the Pantsir S-1 in its standard radar configuration. Whoever positioned that battery thought the 60-kilometer coverage arc was a strength. Ukrainian planners saw it as a cage. One battery, one arc, two targets at opposite edges. The geometry was already a vulnerability. Architect just found it. The planning phase that followed was meticulous. Ukrainian operators needed two strike packages that could reach their respective targets simultaneously, or close enough that the Panzer crew couldn't sequence engagements. The Liutyi strike drones, Ukraine's domestically developed long-range precision munition, were selected for the gas compression station. The Liutyi is a turbofan-powered airframe with a published operational range exceeding 1,000 kilometers, a low radar cross-section, and terminal guidance that can be updated during flight via satellite data link. 14 were allocated to Wave 1. The targeting solution called for concentrated impact on 3 specific compression units. Not broad area saturation, but surgical strikes on the mechanical systems that maintained pipeline pressure. Wave 2 required a different airframe. The Voronezh target was deeper inside Russian territory, and the approach vectors available favored a smaller, lower signature drone that could navigate terrain masking more effectively than the Liutyi's flight profile allowed. The modified Beaver drones, a heavier payload variant of Ukraine's domestically developed naval reconnaissance platform adapted for land attack missions, were selected. 9 aircraft. The modification added a penetrating warhead package optimized for equipment destruction rather than area effect, specifically designed to disable the transmission hardware inside the relay station's main building while leaving the structure partially intact. A collapsed building can be rebuilt. Destroyed transmission arrays take months to replace. The routing decision was the most complex element of the entire plan. Both waves needed to approach from divergent vectors. Not just different directions, but vectors that would force the Panzer radar to physically reorient between engagements. The Panzer S1's radar can track multiple targets, but its engagement capacity against a coordinated multi-axis approach degrades significantly when simultaneous threats appear at opposite edges of the coverage arc. Ukrainian planners routed the Liutyi wave on a northwestern approach vector, keeping low and using terrain masking through river valleys in the final approach leg. The Beaver wave came from the northeast, using a higher altitude transit corridor that brought them into detection range several minutes after the Liutyi signatures first appeared on Russian radar. The 4-minute stagger between impact times was deliberate, not an accident of routing geometry, a calculated decision. Give the Panzer crew just enough time to engage the first wave, to commit their missile load, before the second wave penetrated the arc from a different vector. 4 minutes is long enough for a radar operator to acquire, track, and engage multiple targets in a primary threat package. It is not long enough to reload a Panzer launcher that has expended its ready magazine. This wasn't improvised warfare. This was systems analysis applied to air defense mathematics. Ukraine's planners had built a trap out of geometry and timing, and on the night of July 6th, they sprung it. Stay with me, because what happens in the next segment of this story changes everything we thought we knew about how Ukraine is fighting this war. The execution phase revealed something in Russian air defense doctrine that no one expected. And the evidence comes from Russia's own records. The evening of July 6th began quietly in the target areas. The Novopskov gas compression station was running at standard operational parameters, staffed by a skeleton night crew managing automated systems under Russian military administrative control. Security at the facility was light. A perimeter guard force, cameras, and the assumption that the nearest Ukrainian strike capability was beyond the range of most of Ukraine's known drone inventory. That assumption was already obsolete. It had been obsolete for months. The Voronezh relay station operated under tighter security, given its military communications function. The facility was designated as a military object, staffed by Russian military signals personnel, with physical security appropriate to its classification. What it didn't have was independent air defense coverage. The planners in Moscow who established the facility's security posture had determined that the Panzer battery's 60-kilometer arc was sufficient. On paper, it was. On the night of July 6th, that assessment became a catastrophic miscalculation. At 11:49 p.m. local time, the 14 Liutyi drones of Wave 1 crossed into the outer detection envelope of the Panzer battery. The radar operators almost certainly acquired signatures at that range. The Liutyi's low radar cross-section reduces detection range significantly compared to conventional munitions, but 14 airframes on a converging approach generate a detectable return. What the Russian crew saw on their screens was a large incoming threat package from the northwest. Standard engagement protocol for the Panzer S1 calls for engaging the lead elements of an approaching formation at maximum range to thin the package before it closes to point defense range. The crew executed their doctrine correctly. That's the brutal irony of this story. They did exactly what they were trained to do. They began engaging the Liutyi formation at extended range, firing rapidly to saturate the approach corridor with interceptors. Russian air defense logs, partially published by Ukrainian military intelligence in the days following the strike, show the battery fired 11 missiles in 90 seconds. 11 missiles. The Panzer S-1's ready magazine holds 12. By 12:01 a.m. on July 7th, the battery had one interceptor remaining. At 12:02 a.m., the Beaver drones of Wave 2 appeared on radar from the northeast. 9 airframes. Different vector. Different altitude profile. The crew had one missile. What would you have done in that moment? One interceptor, 9 incoming drones on a separate vector, and the realization that your targeting sequence had just been reverse engineered by an adversary who planned this down to the minute. Comment below. Was there any way out of this trap? Or was the outcome inevitable from the moment the first Liutyi crossed into radar range? The Panzer crew fired their remaining interceptor at the lead Beaver drone and missed. Intercept probability against a maneuvering low-signature drone at extended range with a single shot is mathematically poor. The shot was the right call, the only call, but it failed. The battery then went to emergency protocols, transmitting contact reports and requesting support from adjacent air defense units. Those requests went into a command network that, within minutes, would no longer be fully functional. Wave 1 reached the Novopskov compression station at 12:03 a.m. 14 Liutyi drones. The attack sequencing had been programmed to maximize infrastructure damage while minimizing the risk of a single early detonation alerting the facility's security systems. The drones approached from 3 separate subvectors, with the first impacts designed to disable the primary compression unit control systems before follow-on munitions struck the mechanical infrastructure itself. The compression station's security cameras captured the opening seconds of the strike. That footage was later recovered and analyzed by Ukrainian intelligence teams. The first detonations were precise, not massive explosions. The Liutyi's warhead is optimized for equipment destruction, not blast spectacle. The control building took 2 hits in rapid succession, then the compression unit housing, then the pipeline junction equipment on the station's eastern side. The entire strike sequence lasted less than 40 seconds. The result was not a fire, it was a shutdown. A pressure cascade that propagated through the connected pipeline segment as the compression capacity failed, not explosively, but systematically. Ukrainian analysts estimated the pipeline segment serving Russian-occupied territory lost meaningful pressure within 8 minutes of the strike. By 12:20 a.m., fuel distribution systems dependent on that pressure were offline. Russian armor units in the region, operating T-72B3 tanks and BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles that rely on vehicle heating systems in cold weather, were running on stored thermal capacity from their own vehicle systems. On an unusually cold night for June in occupied Luhansk, with temperatures dropping to near 3 degrees Celsius, that margin mattered more than it normally would. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Russia had invested significantly in hardening its rear area infrastructure against exactly this kind of strike. Secondary compression capacity existed at adjacent facilities. Emergency bypass routing was theoretically available, and yet the pressure cascade continued for hours after the initial strike. Ukrainian analysts reviewing the aftermath concluded that Russian maintenance protocols for the bypass systems had degraded significantly over the preceding months, a consequence of the broader logistical strain on Russian rear area operations that had been building since late 2025. The hardened backup didn't work because it hadn't been properly maintained. The war was eroding Russian capability in ways that didn't show up in satellite imagery or order of battle assessments. Wave 2 reached the Voronezh relay station at 12:07 a.m., 4 minutes after Wave 1's impact. The 9 Beaver drones executed a pattern strike optimized for the facility's known layout. GUR had mapped the building footprints and internal equipment configuration from imagery and signals intelligence collected over several months of observation. 3 drones targeted the primary transmission array on the facility's northern side. 2 targeted the backup power systems in the eastern equipment building. 4 targeted the main relay hall where the transmission hardware was housed. The strike was complete in under 60 seconds. Unlike the compression station, the relay hub fire was visible. The transmission equipment burned intensely once the building's roof was breached, generating a thermal signature captured by commercial satellite imagery on the next available overpass several hours later. That imagery was subsequently published by Ukrainian OSINT analysts and confirmed the strike's effect on the facility's main structure. How many critical communication data links were severed by the Voronezh strike? We asked that question earlier in this video. The answer, drawn from Ukrainian military intelligence assessments and corroborated by subsequent Russian communications analysis. Encrypted data links to 3 Russian army groups were disrupted for over 5 hours. The relay station served as the switching node for military communications, covering a significant portion of Russia's operational command network in the south. Its loss didn't silence those commands. Russian military communications have redundancy by design, but it forced a shift to backup systems that operated at lower encryption standards and required authentication procedures that added significant latency to command transmission times. 5 hours. That number is the strategic core of this operation. In the immediate aftermath of a precision strike on your rear area infrastructure, The first hours are when coordinated response matters most. You need to assess damage, reroute logistics, redirect air defense assets, notify higher command. All of that requires communications. And for 5 critical hours after the Novopskov and Voronezh strikes, Russian commanders coordinating across those 3 army groups were doing it through degraded backup systems, on frequencies and protocols that their signals personnel were less familiar with, at a moment when speed and clarity were most essential. The leaked Russian internal assessment, described in Ukrainian military intelligence reporting as a document circulated within Russian command channels in the week following the strike, used language that Ukrainian analysts found remarkable for its candor. The document reportedly characterized the operation as, quote, a coordinated suppression attack that we did not anticipate from a non-state actor. That phrase. Again, non-state actor. Whatever the political framing, the military judgment embedded in that assessment is precise. Russia's planners had not modeled Ukraine as capable of this kind of multi-axis, time-coordinated deep strike. Their threat assessment had underweighted Ukrainian long-range strike development, and they were now updating that assessment under the worst possible circumstances. After the fact, with infrastructure offline and communications degraded. What this operation reveals, looking at it from the outside, is the asymmetry Ukraine has been building. Russia spent decades and billions on a layered air defense architecture designed to stop peer adversaries. NATO aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic strikes. Ukraine spent months reverse engineering the gaps in that architecture, then built strike packages specifically sized and routed to exploit those gaps. Not by outspending Russia, by outthinking them. The Liutyi is not an F-35. The Beaver is not a Tomahawk, but they don't need to be. They need to be smart enough, precise enough, and coordinated enough to defeat a single Panzer battery covering too much arc with too little magazine depth. Here's the take that's going to generate pushback. Russia's strategic failure here wasn't the Panzer crew's performance. Those operators executed their doctrine correctly under impossible circumstances. The failure was institutional. It was the decision made by planners months or years before July 6th to rely on a single battery as the primary coverage asset for a 60-kilometer arc containing 2 high-value targets. That decision was made by someone senior enough to allocate air defense assets. It reflected an institutional assumption that Ukraine would not develop the capability to execute this kind of coordinated deep strike. That assumption was arrogance dressed up as threat assessment. And 23 Liutyi and Beaver drones proved it catastrophically wrong. The aftermath assessment that Ukrainian forces conducted in the days following the strike drew on multiple intelligence streams. Satellite imagery confirmed the physical damage to both facilities. Signals intelligence traced the duration and character of the communications disruption. Human intelligence sources in occupied territory provided ground truth reporting on the effects of the gas pressure loss on Russian military operations. The picture that emerged was more comprehensive than a simple damage assessment. The gas compression station outage affected Russian logistics at a moment when cold weather was already straining vehicle maintenance cycles. Ukrainian intelligence estimated that armor units in the affected region experienced increased mechanical failures in the week following the strike. Cold-soaked engines and hydraulic systems that didn't receive adequate heating overnight, showing elevated breakdown rates during subsequent operational activity. These effects don't show up in satellite imagery. They show up in maintenance logs and vehicle readiness reports that Ukrainian intelligence was tracking through sources in occupied territory. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Not the headlines, not the propaganda on either side, but the tactical mechanics that determine why operations succeed or fail. This is what we do here. The communications disruption during those 5 hours had a second-order effect that took Ukrainian analysts longer to identify. When Russian commanders shifted to backup communication systems during the blackout period, they were using protocols that were less secure and required more transmission time for authentication. Some communications that would have been handled through the encrypted relay network were deferred, commanders choosing to wait for system restoration rather than transmit sensitive operational information on less secure backup channels. That deferral meant that certain coordination decisions that should have happened in the hours immediately following the strike were delayed further. The operational timeline of Russian response was stretched, not just by the blackout itself, but by the behavioral response of commanders to operating in a degraded communications environment. Ukrainian drone operators who participated in the mission gave post-operation debriefs that were summarized in official reporting. The debrief descriptions emphasized the precision of the flight planning and the discipline of maintaining vector separation between the 2 waves during the terminal approach phase. Operators monitoring the Beaver drone's telemetry feeds in the final minutes before impact reported that the Panzer battery's engagement radar, visible on Ukrainian electronic intelligence receivers, shifted orientation multiple times during the Liutyi wave engagement, then went to what appeared to be rapid scan mode as the battery expended its last interceptors. When the Beaver signatures appeared on the receivers from the northeast vector, there was no engagement radar emission directed toward them. The battery was dry. The operators' language in those debriefs, as reported, was clinical, professional. These were people executing a complex plan they had rehearsed and refined over weeks of preparation. 0 casualties in the drone operations team. The mission parameters achieved. Impact within planned time windows. Both targets struck. Both effects confirmed. The language of people who did exactly what they planned to do. Russia attempted to minimize the significance of the strikes in official statements, characterizing the damage as minor and the operational effect as negligible. Those statements contradicted satellite imagery that showed significant structural damage at both facilities, and they contradicted the evidence of the communications disruption that Ukrainian signals intelligence had documented in detail. Russian official statements about Ukrainian strikes have a consistent pattern of minimization that analysts have learned to calibrate against observable evidence. The observable evidence here was unambiguous. The compression station was offline for weeks following the strike. Repair crews were photographed at the facility by commercial satellites, working on equipment that required specialized replacement parts. The relay station in Voronezh required even longer for restoration of full functionality. The transmission arrays are not off-the-shelf equipment, and sourcing replacements under wartime sanctions pressure added complexity to the repair timeline. If you believe that tactical innovation and intelligence superiority can offset material disadvantage in modern warfare, type war vector in the comments. Because that's what this operation demonstrated. Ukraine doesn't have Russia's numbers. Ukraine doesn't have Russia's stockpiles. What Ukraine has is a military culture that adapted to its constraints and built capabilities specifically designed to defeat an adversary that still thinks in Soviet-era terms about rear area security. The Liutyi drone program is the clearest expression of that adaptation. Ukraine began developing long-range strike drones after it became clear that Western partners would provide weapons capable of striking Russian territory only under restrictive conditions and with political friction that created operational delays. Rather than waiting for permission to use Western weapons, Ukrainian engineers built their own. The Liutyi represents years of development under wartime conditions, compressed timelines, engineering under pressure, testing through actual combat operations. The result is a weapon that can reach targets over 1,000 kilometers from launch point, navigate to precision coordinates, and deliver a payload sufficient to destroy industrial equipment. Built in Ukraine, operated by Ukrainians, without anyone's permission. The Beaver drone's land attack modification tells a similar story. The original Beaver platform was developed as a naval reconnaissance asset, part of the maritime drone program that sank Russian Black Sea Fleet vessels without Ukraine having a conventional navy capable of challenging Russian warships. Ukrainian engineers took that platform, studied the mission requirements for deep land attack strikes, and modified the airframe to carry the necessary payload and guidance systems. Improvisation becoming doctrine. The same creative pressure that produced naval drone warfare producing a new category of deep strike capability. What would NATO have done differently with this targeting problem? Comment your tactical analysis. Because the military analysts who've been studying this operation have reached divergent conclusions, and the debate is worth having. Some argue that NATO would have used different routing and timing. Others point out that the fundamental insight, identifying the single battery gap and routing 2 packages through it, is the kind of analytical work that any competent intelligence organization would produce given sufficient surveillance coverage. The difference, they argue, is that Ukraine had the will and the capability to act on the analysis. The lessons that Russian planners are drawing from this operation are visible in the subsequent repositioning of air defense assets in rear areas. Commercial satellite imagery has tracked additional Pantsir and Tor-M, 2 batteries moving into positions that reduce single battery coverage arcs and eliminate the kind of 60-kilometer responsibility that left both the compression station and the relay hub dependent on one interceptor system. The lesson is being applied. But applying lessons requires acknowledging them, and acknowledging that Ukraine executed a coordinated deep strike operation more sophisticated than Russian planners thought possible is its own form of institutional damage. The operation on the night of July 6th, 2026 will be studied. Not primarily because of the physical damage. The compression station will be repaired, the relay hub eventually restored. It will be studied because of what it demonstrated about the evolution of Ukrainian strike capability and the systematic approach Ukrainian planners applied to identifying and exploiting a specific vulnerability in Russian rear area defense architecture. The simultaneous multi-axis approach, the 4-minute stagger calculated against the Pantsir's magazine capacity, the divergent approach vectors that forced radar reorientation, the targeting sequencing designed to maximize disruption rather than maximize destruction. One detail that stuck with me in reviewing the post-operation assessments, the phrase in Russia's own internal document, non-state actor. Russia's military commanders were still, in July 2026, framing Ukraine through a conceptual lens that denied Ukraine the status of a pure military threat. That framing isn't just politically motivated. It reflects a genuine analytical failure that has compounded Russian miscalculations throughout this war. Ukraine adapted, Russia's threat assessment didn't keep pace with that adaptation, and the Panzer crew on the night of July 6th paid the operational price for an institutional failure that happened far above their level. Will Russia adapt its rear area air defense architecture fast enough to close the vulnerabilities that Ukraine has demonstrated it can exploit? Comment yes or no. The analysts we follow are split on this, not because the answer is unclear, but because the rate of Russian institutional adaptation has been inconsistent throughout this war. Some lessons get absorbed. Others get buried in bureaucracy or denied out of institutional pride. Which outcome follows July 6th is a question the next 6 months will answer. The tactical lesson from the dual strike operation of July 6th, 2026 is precise. A single air defense asset covering 2 high-value targets within its maximum arc creates a mathematical vulnerability that a capable adversary will exploit. The magazine limitation of any interceptor system defines a maximum number of engagements in a single encounter. Saturate that limit with one threat package, and the second package operates in uncontested airspace. Ukraine's planners built that mathematics into their mission architecture and executed it with timing precision that gave the Panzer crew no option but to deplete their magazine on wave 1. Earlier in this video, we asked how many encrypted datalinks were severed by the Voronezh relay station strike. The answer: 3. 3 Russian army groups lost primary encrypted communications connectivity for over 5 hours following the strike on the relay hub. The disruption affected command coordination during the critical initial response window, degraded the quality and speed of damage assessment reporting through official channels, and forced commanders to operate on backup systems with higher authentication latency and lower encryption standards. The 5-hour window wasn't chosen arbitrarily. Ukrainian planners assessed that 5 hours of communications degradation during a night operation would prevent effective coordinated response until daylight, when visual reconnaissance and face-to-face coordination became available as alternatives to the disrupted network. Was the 4-minute stagger between wave impacts the decisive element? Or would the operation have succeeded with a different timing sequence? Could Russia have repositioned additional air defense coverage to close the 60-kilometer arc vulnerability before it was exploited, if their threat assessment had been more current? And what would you have done differently if you had been the Ukrainian planner responsible for routing 2 strike packages through a single battery coverage arc with a 90-second magazine drain window? These are the questions that will occupy military analysts for years. Because the July 6th operation isn't just a story about one night's drone strikes. It's a case study in how a military operating under severe resource constraints identifies and exploits cognitive gaps in an adversary's defensive architecture. Ukraine didn't outspend Russia on this mission. Ukraine outthought them. And the gap between those 2 forms of advantage is what determines who wins the wars that matter. Subscribe to War Vector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The tactics, the intelligence, the decisions, and the consequences. Analyzed without the propaganda and without the simplifications that turn complex operations into comfortable narratives. The fields east of Novopskov are quiet now in the summer heat. The compression station sits partially operational behind temporary repairs, its main unit still awaiting replacement equipment. In Voronezh, a rebuilt relay station slowly restores functionality through components sourced through supply chains that Western sanctions have made difficult. And somewhere in the Ukrainian planning infrastructure, analysts are already studying the next gap, the next arc. The next Panzer battery covering too much with too little. Modern warfare doesn't wait for repairs to finish. It moves to the next vulnerability. Real tactics, real consequences. War Vector.